One of the most depressing aspects of these past 4 years has been the downgrading of the character of those people that many of us previously admired, the fall of the so-called heroes to the revised status of zeros. Nowhere has this been more obvious than in the facile world of celebrity, which, if we're honest, we might have expected, despite just how shocking many of their pronouncements were. The D-listers of British daytime and chat show television and radio parroting the government narrative was standard fare, but even in this, the very shallowest of shallow moral and philosophical pools, the ease with which tyrannical, fascistic, and downright totalitarian opinions easily spewed out of them really was something to behold. And these opinions came from the supposedly nice crowd: Lorraine Kelly, Dermot O'Leary, Esther Ranson, Holly Willoughby, and her sidekick man-baby predator of teenage male interns, Philip Schofield. One might have expected these authoritarian takes from those odious, self-regarding, edgy radio talk hosts like Nick Ferrari and James Whale, and the loathsome and utterly revolting witchfinder general himself, Piers Morgan. But these were people whose entire shtick is dripping with performative compassion. But will such people spend their working lives being distracting to the unemployed or exhausted young mothers and mildly comforting to the lonely elderly? These were, of course, never people to be admired, no matter how kind they appeared to be. But what of actors? They also entertain us, but often at a deeper and sometimes a more profound level. Filmmaking, and television to some extent, is an art, and actors are part of that. A good film should affect us. So when a good actor delivers a convincing performance, we applaud it. But it is just a good performance. It is not real, no matter how genuine it feels. It's an act. The clue is in the name. So whether it's Anthony Hopkins or Vin Diesel, it is essentially just pretend. We can revere the performance for what it is, but we should be very wary of revering the performer. Of course, actors can have an opinion like anybody else, but when they blur the line between reality and fantasy, it can actually become quite embarrassing. Like when Robert De Niro said he wanted to punch Donald Trump in the face. De Niro is without question a brilliant actor, most notably when playing tough guys and gangsters. But he's not really a gangster. He's just pretending. But what of those from whom we might reasonably have expected something different? That of the world of music, more specifically the world of rock, punk, and rap. Because this was where all the rebels were, wasn't it? This was where the fight back was really going to come from. Our anti-establishment heroes, going all the way back to the 60s, were definitely going to stick it to the man, as they always had, weren't they? Well, as it turned out, actually they weren't. Actually, that was the very last thing they were going to do. Despite once actually having been a teenager, going to a new school at 15 and like everyone else, desperate to fit in, I dived into the music that I knew was popular at the time at my new school. Thankfully, that music was heavy metal. I say thankfully mostly because in 1983 it could very easily have been Duran Duran and Culture Club, and I would now be cringing at photographs of myself wearing eyeliner. But I chose my music as a tool to being, well, not quite popular, but as a way of avoiding a social death. And although I still like loads of it, it was a means to an end. It wasn't something I couldn't live without. Even then, I don't think I ever idolised Bon Scott, Richie Blackmore, or Eddie Van Halen. And I've never really understood why people do idolise musicians, pop stars, or pop stars as I mischievously like to call them. I remember reading about one of these pop stars. It might have been Joe Strummer or somebody else who thought he was cool, who said, as a way of offering up his streetwise wisdom on conflict, where a foreign revolutionary was talking about his fight for peace, that fighting for peace is like fucking for virginity. And I remember thinking at the time, What a moron. I remember thinking, is this what you think is profound? He obviously thought it was clever, and many of my friends thought so too. I didn't. I thought he was a fool, just as I thought the multi-millionaire Rolls-Royce Phantom 6 owner John Lennon was a fool when he sang Imagine No Possessions. So I was never particularly enraptured by individual pop stars, but I was often admiring, not just because of their money or their fame, but because they seemed to have succeeded in the world on their own terms. They didn't have to cut their hair or wear a suit to work like the rest of us did, and that was attractive. In my unformed 16-year-old brain, I really did think that in that respect at least, they didn't conform. That was where the rebellion was, and not in ill-formed and asinine statements about geopolitics. So when March of 2020 rolled around, I eagerly anticipated the flood of these independently minded rebels to stick two fingers up to the lockdowns, the masks, and especially the injections. And I waited and waited and waited. Instead, what we got was total compliance with the establishment. In fact, it was worse than that. We didn't just get sullen, dumb obedience, which would have been bad enough. We actually got enthusiasm. Enthusiasm for the lockdowns, enthusiasm for the restrictions on freedom, and almost as soon as they were available, unbridled and unquestioning enthusiasm for the injectables and the vast pharmaceutical multinationals that were providing them, and for the governments that were pushing them. How very rock and roll. Some of the worst were Adele, who swiftly announced that the unvaccinated were unwelcome at her concerts, supposedly too cool for school Dave Grohl's Foo Fighters, who appeared to require their drummer Taylor Hawkins, along with everyone else in their entourage, to get vaxxed, and who then coincidentally died suddenly shortly after. And perhaps the most cringing, the most craven, and the most arse-licking of any rock stars, or indeed of any musicians anywhere, were the Kaiser Chiefs, who encouraged their fans to cheer independently for Pfizer, then Moderna, and then AstraZeneca. Thankfully, they will be known as the Pfizer Chiefs forevermore. There's no coming back from that. For a comprehensive list, have a look at the video for the song Ain't No Rock and Roll by one of the very, very few musicians that call this shit out, the band 5 Times August. Among those aforementioned, there are those from whom you might not have expected anything better, but there are also some that I personally was very bitter about, namely Bruce Springsteen, Bob Dylan, and even AC/DC. And some were so pathetic that they instantly became shameful caricatures of themselves, like Rage Against the Machine. But the reason I mention this is not to bring any fresh information to the discussion. I'm sure you already all know this, but to highlight that there are dissenting voices. Even in the world of music, there are exceptions. They're rare, but they're there. Ian Brown of the Stone Roses, 80s novelty outfit Right Said Fred, who'd have guessed that? Vaccine-injured guitar maestro Eric Clapton, and the morally towering figure of Van Morrison, who's been kicking against all this since it started. Let me know if you can think of any others. I've been thinking for some time that the COVID narrative wouldn't ever be allowed to collapse. There were just too many people, too many institutions, and just too many vested interests for it to be allowed to actually collapse. I thought that what would happen instead would be more like a crumbling. A collapse would mean that many of the guilty would be left buried beneath righteous rubble or exposed. Think Matt Hancock being spotted and recognised in the street without his bodyguards. A crumbling, though, would enable their escape unscathed, whilst the rest of us would be left dealing with the decaying edifice. As what remains of the West institutions finally begin to wake up and can no longer feasibly ignore the overwhelming evidence of the crimes done in their name, or perhaps the realisation that it will not in the end be the institutions that pay for the crimes, but them personally, the doctors, the nurses, the middle managers, individual police officers and civil servants, they may finally start to take some corrective action, if only to save their own hides. Of course, this will be first in the form of legal cases and prosecutions, which even at the best of times move at a glacial pace. With so much institutional resistance, with activist judges blocking them at every turn, and appeals getting thrown out for the tiniest of technicalities, actual justice could take years or decades, even if it ever comes. Statutes of limitations in many jurisdictions may just be the tactic employed to delay and delay and delay and run down the clock to it being classed as historical and therefore beyond the reach of justice. Anthony Fauci, to take just one example, is already well over 80. Many of the other guilty men will then be dead anyway, as will many, many more of the innocent. Bearing in mind what I've just said, it is tempting to believe that justice will never be served. Certainly there will be some, perhaps many, who will never pay for their crimes. But I don't think that'll be the case for everyone. They say that people have short memories, but I think that's only true for the midwits. For the 80% in the middle, the 80% who did nothing whilst our free society was being dismantled over a cold, the 80% of normies, or as Mrs. X likes to call them, the drongos, will not do anything. They never have, and they never will. But the 80% have never changed society. It has always been the 1% at the very top who, with the connivance of a collection of useful idiots and corrupt greasy pole climbers, have always changed society for the betterment of themselves and made it worse for everyone else. And it has always been a determined, tiny minority, 5% at most, that have changed society for the better. That's us, by the way. If that sounds arrogant, that's just too bad. I refuse to be lumped in with the bulk of the population that acquiesced without a fight, without question even, and I absolutely refuse to be associated with people who I previously respected, who at the first sign of danger covered their faces, rolled up their sleeves, and ran to totalitarian authority and snitched on their friends, neighbours, and work colleagues. It was us that resisted this shit, not them. It was us that put our livelihoods, our reputations, and our social standing on the line. And some of us, the most noble and the most courageous, risked a great deal more than that. And I'm finding there are more and more people that are definitely not part of the 80%. And these are people that you might never have spotted. And when I say that I'm finding them, many, of course, I'm finding them, like you good people, online. And due to the miracle of the internet, I've been able to find them in real life too. My brilliant artist friend Pete from Bolton, the unbullyable, unmaskable teacher Rob from Lincolnshire, my principled and learned friend Mark from deepest Somerset, the super patriot ex-Muslim Momus from Essex via Kuwait and Pakistan, and my libertarian kindred spirit Frank from North Carolina. In time, I hope to meet many more of you. And although I've found that some of my friends have not been on the same page as myself, thankfully, many have. Some have become closer friends since the great schism that has occurred. I won't name them since they may not wish to be named, but they will know who they are. An old friend who has been a steadfast Tory all his adult life, even when it was deeply unfashionable to be so, and is now, in his own words, politically homeless, revealed himself, despite being vaxxed himself, as having an unshakably principled opposition to the mandates. My work colleague is also of a similar mind, although he approaches things from a different, more Christian direction. And I have regular conversations with one of my oldest friends from secondary school, who was somewhat exiled in Belgium for reasons of circumstance that contribute to keeping me sane. But as I travel through what seems like an unstoppable decline of everything I thought would last forever, I'm meeting more and more kindred spirits. For instance, I go to a libertarian drinks meeting once a month. It's mostly a talking shop rather than a hashing out of policy or directives. We're not plotting to blow up railways, or at least I couldn't admit to it if we were. But it's just nice to hang out with people who are, well, not totalitarians. And although we didn't know that at the time, that didn't used to be the case. Just the other week, I was parking my car in town, and as I walked along the line of other parked cars, I saw that the owner of another car, another Jag as it happens, had put some notices on his windscreen about why he did not have any tax on his car, and warnings to anybody who might ticket or clamp his car and the consequences for doing so. If I'd had a decent camera on my phone, I would have taken a picture. But that was enough for me to think, I like the cut of this man's jib. And so I left a note with my number, and we met for a cuppa so he could tell me some more. I will report back when I know further. And then just last week, I received a text from another old friend who I've been out of contact with for some time. This was a chap I'd met in Darwin, Australia in 1989, who often welled up my blowing motorbike exhaust. We've been friends ever since, but as he lives in Scotland, sadly our paths rarely cross. But if we have mutual friends, and since both he and they are hardcore bikers, I'm not, they tend to see each other more often. And I had heard from these mutual friends that he was dead against the whole pandemic hysteria. And I was encouraged by that, but had never had the chance to discuss it with him. But anyway, we had a follow-up phone call, and it turned out that he has had real personal losses, almost certainly due to the you-know-what. Without going into details, there was just too much anecdotal stuff for this to be any kind of coincidence. Maybe Scotland got a bad batch, because that was that guy John Watt from Glasgow who challenged Rishi Sunak on the television about his injury, and his fellow Scot Alex Mitchell, who lost a leg to a blood clot. But the upshot of that is that my friend is having a dilemma concerning a doctor in his social circle, who is even now, even after all the circumstantial evidence, as well as all the actual confirmed harm of that notorious intervention, still recommending and pushing it. And my friend is obviously having a hard time ignoring this, as well he might. And this is a dilemma that I have not thankfully had to face, and perhaps that is due to my own cowardice in not confronting those who are complicit. And perhaps it is, and perhaps it isn't. But this is tricky. But then again, maybe it isn't. Remember that brilliant film based on the James Ellroy novel, LA Confidential? In it, one of the three main protagonists, an ambitious and by-the-book young policeman, Edmund Exley, played by Guy Pearce, was unafraid of giving evidence against his fellow officers after a brawl in their police station. His senior officer asked him, incredulous, if he was prepared to be despised the rest of his fellow officers, to which he replies, "Yes, sir, I am." So maybe it's not so tricky after all. Edmund Exley was not a pleasant person, and if you were one of his colleagues, perhaps going into a dangerous situation, he wouldn't be the kind of policeman that you choose to watch your back. In an organisation such as a police force, there is inevitably an esprit de corps, which allows the unit to function effectively as a whole. Such a person couldn't be trusted to back you up if you made a mistake in the heat of battle, perhaps by killing an innocent bystander or an unarmed suspect. And if he couldn't be trusted to do that, perhaps he couldn't also be trusted to put his life on the line when it was required. Of course, the flip side of that trust is that it inevitably fosters an insidious corruption, and that kind of corruption also inevitably fatally hollows out an institution. Perhaps I should be a bit more Edmund Exley. Maybe we should all be. Maybe the key to bringing these midwits to account is to be a bit less nice and a bit more prepared to be despised. It certainly seems as if my friend is losing patience with being nice, considering the harms inflicted on people. It certainly seems as if he's not about to forgive and forget. But the reason I mention these things is that I'm finding more and more people who are dead against this abomination. There have been others. On my anti-cashless society stall, I met quite a few non-conformists. And it wasn't just a single issue thing either. People were connecting the dots. It wasn't just the importance for keeping cash alive. It was the entire financial system. It was Ukraine. it was the military-industrial complex, it was the Uniparty, it was ULEZ, it was lockdowns, masks and the you-know-what. It was net zero, it was chemtrails, it was JFK, it was 9/11, and it is increasingly migration, the Kalergi plan, C40 cities, the Long March through the institutions, and the Cloward-Piven strategy. On our side of the aisle, there have been many false dawns. There have been many, many times that we thought that the sheep were waking up, only to be disappointed. There have been a succession of supposedly based new leaders, like Giorgia Meloni in Italy, who promised much, but then immediately fell in line as soon as she was installed. Geert Wilders in the Netherlands looks as if he may be another, and time may well tell if Nigel Farage is another still. But we have to keep pushing, and we have to keep pushing at the main supports. If we can, we may yet induce the collapse that we need. As I have said, a gradual crumbling will allow the guilty to escape. There are no guarantees here. We may not be successful. The powerful are, well, powerful, and we are not, at least not in the same way. But we are many, not as many as the Drongos to be sure, but we are vastly more numerous than the psychopaths at the top. But if we turn the tables and look at it from the other side, our societies, the West broadly, have not collapsed. They are undermined relentlessly and from multiple different directions at once, so that they crumble rather than collapse. They push us until just before we start to push back. The intention is to make society crumble, but to avoid total collapse. A total sudden collapse will bring us all, them included, down to the same level. They do not want to collapse because they will lose control. And since all this appears to be about control more than it is about anything else, they will do everything they can to avoid a total collapse, just as surely as they will do everything they can to ensure that whatever happens, they will come out on top. Like a parasite that doesn't kill its host, the parasite class desire a terminally decaying society, rather than one that kills over and rapidly expires. The electricity grid must remain intact in order to power the surveillance cameras. It's a crumbling that they want, not a collapse. Sometimes, often in fact, they miscalculate. They have flooded the UK with illegals, confident in the knowledge that our demoralisation via imperial guilt will ensure that we will not react violently. And so far we haven't. But they thought that Ireland was just the same as the UK. They thought that the Irish were just the same as the British. But Ireland never had an empire and were consequently not at all susceptible to being guilt-tripped in the same way. One could almost say that they were racist in that they imagined that all white people were the same. Well, they weren't, and the vigorous response of our Irish cousins is instructive, if not to say inspirational. And if I were to dwell on the negatives, which I won't, I might even say that their reaction has shamed us in Blighty. But we must endeavour to behave in ways that they will not anticipate. Their data collection and record keeping, particularly with regard to excess deaths, was patchy and sloppy. Deliberately so, I think, in order to offer some degree of deniability to the guilty. But the data they have been collecting regarding our response to the lockdowns and other restrictions will be pin sharp. They will have been crunching those numbers to the nth degree. Super powerful mainframe computers will be running AI algorithms in order to predict when and if we fight back. But artificial intelligence is intelligence. That is artificial. It is not human. And perhaps in a narrow sense, our human intelligence may be no match for the electronic kind. And it is probably folly to go up against it head to head, so to speak. But we shouldn't play the game by their rules. We should play our own game, a human game, a game they can't possibly win. Our intelligence is measured not just in our reason and our cognitive abilities, but in our personal relations, our humanity, our principles, and our love for our fellow man. Theirs is just ones and zeros. And we can beat ones, and we can definitely beat zeros.